Imagining an Islamic Anarchism, a new field of study is ploughed. By Anthony T. Fiscella. What research has been accomplished hitherto on the subject of anarchism within Islam? How has Islamic anarchism been approached and conceived by researchers and advocates? How might this field be approached? What are some of the challenges inherent in the study of anarchism in Islam? This chapter attempts to answer these questions while raising new ones. Work by Ahmet Karamustafa, Patricia Crone, Harold Barclay, Peter Lamborn Wilson, Michael Muhammad Knight, Abd al-Hakeem Carney, Heba Raouf Ezzat, Michael Salim, McCarron and Sharif Gemie is discussed and analyzed in light of the goals and reference points of the authors. Material from the Najdiyya Kharijites and Mu tazilites of the 9th century to the contemporary Taqwacore scene is addressed in an attempt to chart the realm of what might be considered to be variations of an Islamic anarchism. Concluding with a tentative model for the study of this new field, the chapter ends by raising questions about the efficacy of current taxonomies and terminologies. There are as many Islams as there are situations that sustain it, Aziz al-Azma. Anarchists from all kinds of backgrounds with all kinds of ideas have sought to make contemporary anarchisms relevant to them in their own unique situations. Jason Adams. Introduction. Time and again scholars inform us that Islam is neither homogeneous nor monolithic. The same could be said of anarchism. Both are highly diverse movements with a wide range of internal clashes, debates and questions about identity and boundaries. Can one then look at such diversity and speak of Islam or anarchism in the singular sense without committing an injustice to one's intended meaning? The two epigraphs above would imply that the task is tricky at best. Yet as broad and diverse as these two spheres are, they do speak of distinct ideological, social, and physical territories. One does not enter an anarchist info shop in Europe in order to join fellow Muslims in prayer. Nor does one enter a mosque in Indonesia in order to find a book by Bakunin. Traditionally, those territories have been viewed as so distinct that they have been regarded by scholars on both sides as not sharing any common ground whatsoever. Nowadays, despite the recognition of internal diversity within both of these global movements, the tendency remains to regard them as entirely separate phenomena. If you look through the Oxford History of Islam, you will not find a single mention of anarchism. Robert Graham's Anarchism, a documentary history of libertarian ideas from 300 BC to 1939, similarly makes no mention of Islam. Both of these cases are examples of the traditional understanding that anarchism and Islam are two completely separate social, political, and historical phenomena. That understanding has finally begun to be questioned. On the side of Islamic studies, the French scholar Charles Pellet used the term anarchists nearly 50 years ago in order to describe certain unnamed Mu'tazilites. On the side of anarchist studies, Peter Marshall included Islam in his 1992 work Demanding the Impossible, A History of Anarchism. Although it amounted to less than a paragraph of comments, his mention of Ismailis, Sufis and the Karamita, the latter on grounds of communism, reflected a willingness to reconsider the traditional understanding that anarchism and Islam are completely separate entities with no significant points of convergence. Only within the last 20 years or so has a connection between anarchism and Islam been seriously examined, and this has been mostly thanks to the work of Peter Lamborn Wilson, Ahmet Karamustafa, and Patricia Crone. Harold Barclay, the anarchist anthropologist and author of People Without Government, made his own contribution to the study of anarchism and Islam with his article Islam, Muslim Societies, and Anarchy, published in Anarchist Studies in 2002. Since then, there has been an increase of the number of articles, essays, and manifestos on the Internet that relate anarchism and Islam, often authored by individuals who self-identify as Muslim and anarchist. These range from the short and succinct Muslim anarchist charter by Yaqub Islam to the lengthy post-structuralist-inspired paths to becoming a Muslim anarchist by Mohammed Jean Vanouz, from the Jordanian anarchist group who states that after reading a book called Sufi Tropics written by an Iraqi writer, Hadi al-Alawi, we found that Sufism is all about anarchism, to the anarcho-Islamic philosophy by an Australian who declares that anarchism as an Islamic philosophy offers the only natural way to bridge the gap between the world we wish to live in and the world we currently live in. Ilham Makdisi, currently a professor at Northeastern University, has written a doctoral dissertation which contains a section that deals with the spread of anarchist and socialist ideas and praxis in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire by migrant European radicals more than a century ago. A Persian man in Sweden by the name of Muhammad Mehdi Safedgar has written an entire book devoted to the idea of an Islamic society going even beyond the laudable ideals of anarchist direct democracy. There is indeed a wealth of potentially relevant material, so much so that while the aim of this chapter is to plough this new field of study, the following limits have had to be applied. First of all, there is a tendency to describe Islam and especially the Shahada, the first pillar of Islam and the Muslim declaration of faith, in terms that sound very close to anarchist ideals. For example, Syed Abdul Latif writes in Islam and Social Change, man should neither be lord over another man, nor a slave to him. Muhammad raised the slogan, La ilaha illallah, there is none worthy of worship except God, to inspire the rise of a new order of life for man. It was the slogan of the freedom of man, of his emancipation from every form of bondage under which his thought and life had quailed in the past. It placed man next to God, brushing aside all the scribes, intercessors and priests and swept away all distinctions of race and color and every hierarchical concept of life, making righteous conduct, amal saleh, the sole criterion of one man's superiority over another. Likewise, Asghar Ali, engineer in Islam and liberation theology, quotes the Egyptian scholar Ahmad Amin as drawing similar conclusions: the ruler who wants to humble us wants to be a god, but there is no god but God. We accept from any man whatever or from any nation whatever, only that they should be a brother or brothers. Democracy, socialism, and social justice in their true meanings will survive and advance because these call for human brotherhood, and this is one of the consequences of no God but God. These descriptions of Islam and the Shahada may share some common ground with anarchist thought or could easily lend themselves to such an interpretation, but, for the limited purposes of this study, the vast terrain that such an examination could entail will not be traversed here. The same holds true for the lack of a priesthood or clerical hierarchy, particularly within Sunni Islam, which, in combination with Islam's egalitarian character, almost implies an anarchic structure in itself. This lack of central order has been amplified by the fall of the Caliphate in 1924 and the rise of globalization. Mandeville speaks of this development of increasingly pluralistic authority as an intensification of a tendency towards decentralized authority that has always been present in Islam. Volpe and Turner go so far as to refer to it as a functional type of anarchism. This brings to mind the sort of anarchical society that Hedley Bull spoke of when analyzing international relations between states in a global arena. To discuss or even review research about the anarchic or egalitarian nature of Islam as such is beyond the scope of this study, but it can be helpful to bear in mind that this type of structural analysis of Islam as anarchic is qualitatively distinct from the conception of an Islamic anarchism, even if the former may be conducive to the latter. Secondly, this chapter only addresses English language research. If there is any significant amount of research on anarchism and Islam in other languages, I am unaware of it. There is, however, some relevant literature by individuals who had close relations with both Muslim and anarchist circles, such as those works by or about Isabel Eberhardt, 1877, 1904, Ivan Agueli, 1869, 1917, or Lida Raffanelli, 1880, 1971, in French, Swedish and Italian respectively, although Eberhardt has been translated into English. As none of them have researched Islamic anarchism nor have any of them become a focal point for contemporary Islamic anarchist research, even if Eberhardt has been mentioned by Wilson, it could be argued that their treatment is better served elsewhere. Thinkers in other languages, particularly Arabic, Farsi, and Turkish, undoubtedly exist but have been beyond my reach. Thirdly, this study shall not address economic stances, whether it be capitalism or socialism. Although there are groups or individuals, such as the Minaret of Freedom Institute, who could qualify as anarcho-capitalist as well as any number of Islamic socialist strains of thought and tradition, I have not found any research on the former, and the latter, though well-researched, does not fall under the working definition of anarchism and is therefore beyond the scope of this study. Fourthly, it happens that certain Islamists such as Syed Qutb are sometimes described as anarchist. The description is understandable. In his book Milestones, first published in 1964, Qutb wrote, "Islam is a declaration of the freedom of man from servitude to other men." Thus it strives from the beginning to abolish all those systems and governments which are based on the rule of man over men and the servitude of one human being to another. While Qutb's stance may sound anarchistic, it is not unambiguous, and I have not discovered any research that has analyzed his political viewpoints as anarchist. This study will not undertake such a task, and since Qutb did not himself state that he was anarchist, his ideas will have to remain unexamined here. Ironically, Gaddafi's ideas are more developed in an anarchistic sense, but he is rarely, if ever, called an anarchist, and despite a number of books having been written about him and his theory, I do not know of any that consider him or his theory to be anarchist. Also, mostly due to space limitations, those groups or individuals that do not consider themselves to be Muslim, such as the 5%ers or any number of anarchist Alawists, shall also remain outside the realm of this examination, even if their anarchistic aspects may be of relevance. Nonetheless, it may be relevant to mention that one could draw a major distinction between Orthodox Sunni Islam and heterodox sects within Islam. Khoury, for example, suggests that Sunni dominance of the city and state predisposed them to develop a political philosophy that favored a central government based on coercion and force. The sects, being more rural-based and not having the same degree of access to force, resorted to moral measures and social bonds as a means of regulating social order and adopted rebellious ideologies rejecting the state. In line with 14th-century sociologist Ibn Khaldun's urban-rural dichotomy, Khoury discerns between the coercive government of the Sunnis and the Asabiyya, bonds of solidarity, of the sects, placing an urban state-friendly religiosity on one side and a tribal state antagonistic religiosity on the other. While interesting, the exploration of Khoury's, or even Khaldun's, stance and the position of heterodox groups in Islam, unless explicitly studied as anarchist, is beyond the scope of this study. Finally, there have been occasional comparisons drawn between Islamic and anarchist terrorism. As these parallels are drawn primarily on the basis of strategical similarities, and not the concept of anarchism or the opposition to the state as such, they too shall be ignored here. For theoretical guidance, this chapter shall draw on a piece by anarchist scholar Sharif Gemie, written in response to an article by Jason Adams wherein he discusses the way we look at Third World anarchism. By outlining a framework for approaching anarchist thought and practice in the Third World, Gemie simultaneously provides a potentially useful model for analyzing anarchism within Islam. The four alternative categories he presents are 1. Imitations of Euro-American anarchism, which he compares to the export of fashion and/or cultural manifestations that have little root in their surroundings. 2. Anthropological anarchisms, which refers predominantly to the lifestyle and practice of tribal societies that lack strong state structures. 3. Openness to other concepts of anarchism, in which Gemie raises the question of how well we are equipped to see alternative conceptions of anarchism, such as Taoism, in light of the fact that our access is often limited when it comes to foreign cultures and our social references tend to constrain what we recognize as anarchist. And 4. Anarchist practice, wherein he cites examples such as the Palestinian Intifada as a social phenomena that bore fundamental similarities to anarchist self-management and direct action. While the first category may be immediately recognized as irrelevant to this study, insofar as it is irreligious, the following three can be tentatively applied as a means to sort through the existing material. This chapter is as much a study in the study of the juncture between Islam and anarchism as it is an overview of various ways in which to examine the intersection between the two phenomena. Rather than attach a rigorous definition to either term, they shall be regarded here more as signposts that imply general areas that are not clearly cordoned off. Islam is here regarded to include the various traditions that revolve around the legacy of Muhammad and the God of the Quran. Without getting into the theological discussion as to who is a heretic and who is a Muslim, that definition is broad without being all-embracing. Likewise, anarchism is here regarded primarily as the opposition to, or disregard for, political authority and sometimes, in addition to that, religious authority as well. As we shall see, the definitions of Islam and anarchism vary according to the perspective of the researcher. Naturally, as there is wide disagreement amongst both anarchists and Muslims as to what is or is not anarchist or Islamic, the same holds true for the conception of Islamic anarchism or Muslim anarchy, which can range from the communistic to the individualistic, from something potentially rooted in segmentary lineage systems to the mere refutation of the idea that the imamate is obligatory. Beginning with a brief summarization of some of the main works within this area of research, and including a short presentation of a few recent advocates for Islamic anarchism, this chapter will follow up with a comparative analysis of the various visions of Islamic anarchism that are articulated by researchers and or advocates, and finally this chapter will conclude with an alternative to Gemie's model as well as comments regarding the implications of the analysis and the challenges presented. To researchers in this area of study. The study of Islamic anarchism to date. Ahmet Karamustafa is currently Professor of History and Religious Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. A Muslim himself since birth, he authored God's Unruly Friends, a book which charts antinomian dervish groups between the years 1200 and 1550. The specific groups that he mentions are Calendars, Haydaris, Abduls of Rum, Jamis, Bektasis, Shamsi Tabrizis in Asia Minor, and Madaris and Jalalis in India, with particular emphasis on the first three of these groups. Though these dervishes often varied in their characteristics, ranging from ascetic hermits to hedonistic groups, they were united in their repudiation of social and religious norms. While the Calendars are described as dervishes who were celibates that engaged in non-productive forms of sexual activity, including the company of boys, the Haydaris, on the other hand, wore large metal rings on their genitals in order to prevent themselves from engaging in sexual intercourse. The Madaris are described as mendicants who refused all clothing and rubbed their naked bodies with ashes. In addition to wearing iron chains around their necks and heads, the Madaris wore black turbans, carried black banners, rejected religious observances, and smoked large amounts of cannabis. Indeed, voluntary poverty, unemployment, nomadism and or group living, nudity and or uniform dress codes, rejection of orthodox Muslim practice, celibacy, sexual deviance, consumption of intoxicants or hallucinogens, the wearing of bracelets, the carrying of certain paraphernalia, such as begging bowls and clubs, body modification, including tattoos, piercing, self-laceration, and shaving, silence, fasting, sleep deprivation, dancing, singing, and drumming all featured as characteristics which the various groups selectively employed to varying degrees. Karamustafa's qualification of these groups as anarchist is based on his definition of anarchism as a practice of active nihilism targeted directly at human society. Twice he notes that one dervish, Atman Baba, consistently compared property, money in particular, to feces. Yet the major focus of dervish ire, according to Karamustafa, was not society in general, but rather institutional Sufism. Karamustafa's main goal here is not to argue that these groups are anarchist but rather to argue that they are Muslim. He begins by observing that these groups have traditionally been discarded as remnants of pre-Islamic traditions, folk religion or otherwise un-Islamic. In contrast, he asserts that they are genuine manifestations of an inherent conflict within Islam between world-embracing and world-rejecting perspectives. Whereas heretical Sufism gradually institutionalized in an Islamic world dominated by the world-embracing approach, antinomian dervish groups arose to affirm a more purist and anti-institutional approach to the world-rejecting spirit. In their eyes, the Sufis were sellouts. True lovers of God had no concern for mundane matters or the approval of aristocrats. Karamustafa demonstrates that despite the opposition of these dervishes to both the world-embracing stance of mainstream Muslims and the compromising stance of institutional Sufism, their practices and form of organization copied that of their Sufi predecessors. Like the Sufi tariqas, the communities of antinomian dervishes were headed by elders, they employed master-disciple relationships, and they commonly applied Sufi spiritual concepts such as faqr, poverty, fana, death before dying, and walaya, sainthood. Thus, he regards Sufism as the institutional parent and the antinomians as the rebellious anarchist offspring. He further exemplifies this connection by noting that many antinomians were assimilated into Sufi orders. The anarchist individualism of the antinomians, Karamustafa maintains, is a latent but potent current within Sufism. Danish-born Patricia Crone is professor of Islamic history at Princeton University in New Jersey. She is author of God's Rule and 9th-century Muslim anarchists. In both studies she lays out the assertion that the only manifestations of anarchism within Islamic history can be traced to the Najdiyya Kharijites and certain members of the Mu tazilites. She begins 9th-century Muslim anarchists by writing, "The people with whom this paper is concerned were anarchists in the simple sense of believers in anarchy, no government. They were not secularists, individualists, communists, social reformers, revolutionaries or terrorists, merely thinkers who held that Muslim society could function without what we would call the state." Thus, for Crone, anarchism is solely the belief in the dispensability of government. According to her, Western anarchist thought can be generally traced to the concept of returning to a utopian condition of innocence that predated the emergence of the state. Islam, on the other hand, is founded on the basic ideas that God is the ruler of the universe, government has always existed, and the utopian goal is not a lack of government but rather an ideal form of government. In practical terms, human society should be governed by an imam, the first of whom was Muhammad. Statelessness, the condition of society before Islam, is regarded pejoratively as jahiliyyah, a state of chaos and disorder. Hence, the institution of the imamate, following Muhammad's example, was to keep the potential for jahiliyyah in check by governing society righteously. The problem by the 9th century, however, was that imams demonstrated a particularly problematic tendency of turning into tyrants. The general response to this quandary was one of three options: replacement of the tyrants with righteous imams, acceptance of tyranny, or rejection of the imamate altogether. The first option was chosen by the majority of Mu'tazilites and Kharijites, as well as Shiites and a few Sunnis, though she does not mention them here, who fought to replace decadent leadership with righteous leadership. The second option became the standard Sunni response to tyranny. Rather than divide the Muslim community through internal feuding, kings, even corrupt ones, should be tolerated but should not be regarded as divinely guided. The third response, which was to reject the imamate altogether, was chosen by a minority amongst the Kharijites and Mu'tazilites. As the latter reasoned, since imams kept turning into kings, the best solution was not to set them up in the first place. These Muslim anarchist groups did not, however, argue that the state was an inherently bad institution as such, only that it was no longer practical. Their point was that the imamate was not to be regarded as a religious obligation in the same way as prayer and fasting. Government was a human convention and an option which could be freely chosen or not according to circumstance. In such a circumstance where government was either impractical or undesirable, some Mu'tazilites argued that the whole community, including criminals, had to chip in by observing the law, while others advocated mob rule, people should take the law into their own hands. Still others advocated a decentralized federalism in which power was vested in the hands of local leaders and patriarchs. Whereas the Mu'tazilites were more philosophically based, the militant Najdiyya set up their argument somewhat differently. The Najdiyya were building upon a tradition within the Kharijites that righteous Muslims had an obligation to take to arms and replace corrupt leadership with righteous leadership. As the Kharijite history of placing their faith in the power of the sword invariably saw them losing more ground than they gained, the Najdiyya came up with the practical idea that if they no longer believed in the idea that the imamate was necessary, then they would no longer be obligated to fight and die to establish it. Furthermore, the Najdiyya argued that a righteous imamate had to be unanimously sanctioned by all Muslims and that this consensus, ijma, had never occurred. They were still open to the concept of replaceable chiefs who would serve the community, but they were strictly opposed to the idea of an imam who would dictate over them. As Crone writes of the Najdiyya, all believers were entitled to their own opinions on law and doctrine on the basis of ijtihad, independent reasoning, for all of them were equally authoritative. Najdiyya Islam was a do-it-yourself religion. Politically and intellectually, a Najdiyya would have no master apart from God. Within their own group then, the Najdiyya were anarchist and egalitarian. At the same time, they regarded only themselves to be true Muslims. Outsiders were, in principle, fair game for enslavement or extermination should they choose to rebel. Clearly, the groups that Crone described fell well within the fold of the Muslim community. She makes no attempt to argue for their right to be classified as Muslims. That much is taken for granted. Her argument then is based on the premise that these two groups qualify as anarchist, and she demonstrates it through their ideological and theological stances, not through any examination of their actual form of organization or behavior. Peter Lamborn Wilson, also known as Hakeem Bey, is an independent researcher who self-identifies as both Muslim, non-practicing, and anarchist, though he does not confine himself to either of these two categories. He spent some years living and working in Iran under the reign of the Shah and returned to the U.S. after the revolution. During the 1980s he authored the seminal work Scandal, Essays in Islamic Heresy, and followed it up with Sacred Drift, Essays on the Margins of Islam. Through these works and other writings he has propagated for both his own brand of anarchism, including but not restricted to individualist anarchism, as well as heretical religiosity, including but not restricted to Islam. Although he lies outside of the realm of officially sanctioned academic research, he has nevertheless made a significant impact on the study, development, and practice of Islamic anarchism. Karamustafa, for example, cites Scandal in his own work, and Michael Muhammad Knight, discussed below, owes the spread of his Taqwacore concept to Wilson's anarchist publishing company Media. It is not possible to do justice here to Wilson's visions of Islamic anarchism in that he offers a number of variants throughout a great deal of writing, which significantly exceeds the amount of consideration that any of the other researchers have given the subject. In general, Wilson's diverse range of anarchistic elements within Islam includes calendars, Ismailis, especially the assassins, the socialist Ali Shariati, Khazar, or the Green Man, whom Wilson associates with militant environmentalism, Khaldoun's Bedouins, Sufis, such as Ibn al-Arabi, al-Hallaj and Rumi, Muammar Gaddafi's Third Universal Theory, and his own Moorish Orthodox Church, originally a white beatnik outgrowth of noble Drew Ali's Moorish Science Temple. In Scandal he devotes an entire chapter to imaginal yoga and sacred pedophilia, an interest that is reflected by his own membership and activism within the North American Manboy Association, NMBL. Wilson's work is easy to read but difficult to follow. He seamlessly blends scholarly research with manifesto in a quest for poetic facts. It would seem that historical research is being used as a vehicle for his manifesto. On one hand, Wilson speaks of a need for the individual to be bound by an ethical and spiritual stance. The antinomian may commit crimes in the eyes of society or the law, but only out of a personal ethics which reaches unimaginably higher than any moral code. Antinomian ethics does this precisely because it is imaginal, made up by the individual, personal, and central. Without a spiritual dimension, the sexual revolution can only betray itself into libertinage and other distortions. On the other hand, he argues that the individual alone has the right to determine the validity of those ethics. Ideally, no other authority above the individual ought to be recognized. Drawing inspiration from his interpretation of the abrogation of the law, Qiyamat, during the assassin reign at Alamut, approximate 1100-1250, he writes, "In a sense, anyone can be the imam, in a sense, everyone already is the imam." The idea of the imam of one's own being implies the idea of self-rule, autarky, each human being a potential king, and human relations carried out as a mutuality of free lords. To liberate everyday life begins with the individual and spirals outward in love to embrace others. Radical, post-Qiyamat, Ismailism restores sovereignty to the individual, who thus becomes his her own authority. Spirituality is not a master-slave relation, it is not an Oriental despotism. Not anymore. Not now. Maybe it never was. Who cares? Here and now, we need something different. In other words, he personally sees a need for some sort of ethical boundaries, but he regards that it be up to each individual to determine where and how those boundaries are to be set up. Interestingly, he also paints a picture of assassin reign at Alamut as consisting of an economic communism which is reminiscent of contemporary syndicalism, and concludes that the assassins constituted a curious blend of individualist anarchism, Bakunanism, and antinomian mysticism. While his approach to Islam is open-ended, his broad definition of anarchism fits in well with that of Karamustafa. One distinction between Wilson's and Karamustafa's variations are that while Karamustafa's dervishes are rejecting society as a necessary means to acquire a certain spiritual status, Wilson's own tact is to advocate autonomous space that excludes society in order for individuals to impose our absolute will, our royaume. L'état, c'est moi. Whether the goal be personal transformation, spiritual insight, or spiritually rationalized hedonism is irrelevant in Wilson's Islamic anarchism. The anarcho-monarchism that Wilson describes and advocates is not just about rejecting society, it is also about establishing the individual as the highest form of authority. Conversely, Karamustafa's dervishes tend to be bound by the quasi-tariqas, the lines of discipleship under the authority of elders, that they have formed with their community of believers. They adhere to a uniform dress code, ritualized behavior, and allegiance, even obedience, to a spiritual master. Though such approaches are lauded by Wilson, such restrictions are not necessary, or even desirable, in his own extended individualist conception of anarchism. Rather than initiation through a living master, Wilson advocates self-initiation through dreams, which he associates with the Ovaisi order in Iran. Many of these groups that Wilson describes are on the margins of both anarchism and/or Islam, and yet Wilson does not make an attempt to argue for their legitimacy in either sense. For him, heresy and the margins of legitimacy are perfectly respectable options. Indeed, this mirrors his political stance that anarchism can remain on the margins of society within temporary, or permanent, autonomous zones and need not aspire to completely overthrow or replace the state. Harold Barclay made his contribution to the study of Islamic anarchism through his article Islam, Muslim Societies, and Anarchy, published in Anarchist Studies. As an anarchist and anthropologist, but not a Muslim, his central concern is charting what might be regarded as anarchist elements within Islam in general. He begins by distinguishing between anarchism as a social-political theory largely developed within 19th-century Europe, which rejects all forms of domination, whether it be the state, government, the church or family structure, and anarchy as the condition in which a society is stateless. It could be noted here that Barclay defines anarchy and anarchism quite differently. While anarchism is opposed to all forms of domination, a narrow definition that could exclude various strains of anarchist thought, anarchy, as Barclay defines it, refers to any society which is stateless, a broad definition which could include societies that employ various forms of domination. In his article he lays out a short summary of Crone's work, mentions Sufi antinomianism briefly, devotes a longer section to Arab Bedouin and Berber anarchic societies, whose anti-state approach was documented by Ibn Khaldun, and ends the article with a critical view of Gaddafi's Third Universal Theory. Barclay's presentation of the Tazilites and the Najdiyya amounts to a concise and uncritical summary of Crone's work and includes older research as well, i.e. Salim, Levy, etc. like Crone. Barclay denies that the Sufi antinomians are anarchist because they were all indifferent to the state rather than opposed to it, and likens them to Nietzsche because they are exclusively concerned with personal as opposed to political transformation. He devotes most of his attention, unsurprisingly perhaps, to Bedouin and Berber societies. Citing his own previously published study and the work of fellow, social, anthropologists Ernest Gellner and Pierre Bourdieu, he describes some of the key elements that characterize anarchy within these Muslim societies. 1. They do not have a state. 2. They do not have a police force. 3. They tend to use elders or councils of elders for their leadership. 4. They are organized according to segmentary lineage principles. 5. Social order is maintained by respect for the leadership as opposed to the coercion of brute force. 6. Mediation is typically applied in the event of disputes as opposed to judicial arbitration. And 7. They believe in the principle of solidarity, that an injury to one is an injury to all, which ultimately extends to all clans in the tribe but not to outsiders. These elements of anarchy, according to Barclay, do not find their origins in Islam but have been perpetuated alongside Islam. When it comes to Muammar Gaddafi, Barclay assesses his third universal theory as a decentralized syndicalist type of arrangement but regards the theory as irrelevant due to Barclay's perception of Gaddafi's reign as profoundly authoritarian. In his conclusion of Islam, Muslim societies, and anarchy, Barclay reveals his point, which is not necessarily to argue for the genuinely anarchist character of any particular Muslim group or society, but rather, by presenting a variety of anarchist and quasi-anarchist expressions, he questions the traditional view that Islam and anarchism are necessarily incompatible. Barclay continued his contribution to the debate on Islamic anarchism by responding to an article that Wilson had written in the anarchist journal Fifth Estate entitled Roses and Nightingales, looking for traditional anarchism in 1970s Iran. In the summer 2004 issue, the two lock horns over which Islamic groups should qualify as anarchist and which should not. Barclay critiques Sufis for being both hierarchical and often closely aligned with the aristocracy. He also criticizes the Sufis and Sharites for their obedience to a supreme leader, and he refers to Crone's claim that the Najdiyya were anarchists. Wilson, who had not read any of Crone's work, responds by referring to Karamustafa and pointing out the large diversity of stances and social organization within Sufism and Shi'ism. According to Wilson, the dervishes and Ismailis may not be card-carrying plumb-line anarchists, but they may be our allies. He concludes by stating, Professor Barclay feels that the rigid Puritan Kharijites are more anarchist than the tolerant mystics, but political structure is not everything. The lawless dervishes may still have a guru. But they lead free lives, or so it appeared to me. The Kharijites may not have a guru, but they live like Cromwellian dragoons. Wa Salam, Peter Lamborn Wilson, New York. In other words, Wilson's priority is on the quality of life itself, and he considers the freedom experienced by the individual to be of more value in determining a desirable anarchist goal than the technical presence or absence of a state or religious authority. To the above research, it can be helpful to add a taste of recent material that explicitly advocates some sort of Islamic anarchism, none of which has been treated by any of the major scholars who have hitherto dealt with anarchism in Islam. Of these, the most well-known is probably that of Michael Muhammad Knight, who, with his book The Taqwacore, has created quite a stir both within Islamic circles and beyond. The same year that his book was published, there was a young American scholar by the name of Abd al-Hakeem Carney who presented a paper at the B.R.I.S.M.E.S. British Society for Middle Eastern Studies conference in London entitled Islam, a Libertarian Alternative? Although his career, along with his life, came to an all-too-early end, he published a few pieces which relate to the subject at hand prior to his departure. While there is much online material that is also relevant to the subject of Islamic anarchism, two have been selected here to give an idea of the sort of range that such a synthesis can imply. The first is Michael Salim McCarron. He is a U.S. Navy veteran, convert to Shiite Islam, and the author of one of the first explicitly Islamic anarchist manifestos entitled Natural Islam. The second one, Heba Raouf Ezzat, has published work, but her article on anarchism is so far only available online, in Arabic, as is the interview with her by Rosemary Beckler. Ezzat is an Egyptian activist and political scientist who lectures at Cairo University. She has previously studied in Germany and has been inspired by European anarchist thought, though she does not identify herself as an anarchist. Michael Muhammad Knight converted to Islam in the 1980s when he was 15 years old. Public Enemy videos on MTV and then the autobiography of Malcolm X had been the original sources of inspiration for him. Eventually, this led him to live and study at the largest mosque in the world, the Faisal Masjid in Pakistan. Ultimately, he became frustrated with the narrow views and hypocrisy he found there and abandoned his orthodox Sunni religiosity. He went to college in the US and began listening to punk rock. Then, bidding farewell to Islam, he wrote an essay of apostasy entitled Forget What Is and Is Not Islam and a novel called The Taqwacore. The latter is a fictional account of a ragtag bunch of Muslim punks living together in Buffalo, New York, and describes the sort of openness that he wished had existed in Islam. In the end, his story inspired real-life Muslims who identified with punk rock to rally together around the Taqwacore ethic. By 2007, Knight's vision had become reality and the first national Taqwacore tour was organized with bands like the Communas, Punjabi Four Bastards, Vote Hezbollah, a band name taken directly from Knight's book, and Al-Thora, Arabic for Revolution. Furthermore, his book inspired Azra Nomani to organize the first woman-led prayer in the United States with Dr. Amina Wadud as imam. As a manifesto, the Taqwacores advocated a radically open Islam in which God is an immediate experience. The Quran loses relevance as a tiny little book for tiny little men, and a female character crosses out a verse from the Quran that allows a man to beat his wife. Here is a selection of concluding thoughts from the main protagonist: fuck the local imam, fuck the PhDs at Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara. Give me the Islam of starry night cornfields with wind rustling through my shirt and reckless Fiscella makeout sprees that won't lead to anything but hurt. Knee-deep in a creek is where I'll find my kitab. If Allah wants to say anything to me, He'll do so on the faces of my brothers and sisters. If there's any law that I need to follow, I'll find it out there in the world. After the rise of the Taqwacore scene in real life, Knight returned to the Muslim fold as a marginal Muslim and ultimately performed Hajj in 2008. He described aspects of his life journey as a Muslim seeker in Blue-Eyed Devil and devoted his next book entirely to the study of the 5 Percenters, originally an offshoot of the Nation of Islam, NOI. Though still feeling indebted to Wilson for publishing the Taqwacores, Knight has disavowed his former mentor due to Wilson's advocacy of pedophilia pederasty. While standing up for an Islam that embraces all sorts of heresies, Knight has felt compelled to draw boundaries of his own. Abd al-Hakeem Carney, a convert to Shiite Islam, deals with the question of boundaries from a more academic perspective. In analyzing political Islam, the need for a new taxonomy, he makes a case for developing a new set of terms that could more adequately approach the realm of Islamic politics. The standard set of terms such as Islamic fundamentalism or Islamism, he contends, are too broad and are misleading because they could often be just as easily applied to libertarian as well as authoritarian Muslims. According to Carney, even the term Salafism, which is more precise, and hence preferable to Islamic fundamentalism, would have to be amended in order to distinguish between apolitical and political or jihadi Salafists. In general, however, Carney's personal concern tends to revolve around an opposition to what he refers to as authoritarian closures of interpretation in which a layperson blindly follows a religious scholar. The alternative is the basic Islamic commitment to obeying God and God alone, which Carney says Islam shares in common with Christian anarchism. He finds inspiration and support for these views in the writings of the famous poet and philosopher Muhyi ad-Din ibn Arabi, the mystic Mullah Sadra, the Sudanese dissident Mahmud Taha, and the conception of the hidden imam within Twelver-Shurism. Elsewhere, Carney treats what he terms the desacralization of power in Islam and argues that the modern conception of the state is basically alien to classical Islamic political concerns. The ideas that he had begun to pursue in his unpublished presentation in 2004 are quite clear in the online abstract, Islamic Libertarianism. Does not assume that the creation of a righteous or just society relies upon state power, but rather on the abolition of such power in most contexts. Had his research continued, it could certainly have grown into one of the more developed expressions of Islamic anarchism. Then there is the text written by Salim McCarron, which advocates a green socialist anarchist stance in alignment with Shariat Islamic teaching. The majority of this 3,000-word manifesto is devoted to a critique of consumerism, capitalism, and the United States government, as well as the means by which those forces can be counteracted, direct action and autonomy. About a quarter of the manifesto is devoted to Islam. He declares that Islam has proven to be the best inspirational source for his own resistance to the culture of destruction and adds that Islam offers communal consultation, shura, stewardship of the Creator's creation, istiklaf, equality, adl, non-aggression, salam, mutually beneficial economics, mudarabat, sharing and giving, sadaqah wa zakat. Like Carney, McCarron cites Mullah Sadra, a Shiite philosopher, as one of his key influences. In accordance with Sadra's teaching, McCarron believes that reasoning should be balanced with inspiration, which is a transcendent source. Hence, McCarron's understanding of Islam is based in gnosis, ma'rifat, and not just fiqh, jurisprudence. This leads him to conclude that guidance from the hidden Imam is open to all and that we are all equal and our affairs should be governed by communal consultation, shura. There can be no hierarchy of the righteous, no need for a guardian council as it exists in Iran. He then ties this into a non-anthropocentric concept of stewardship which, according to McCarron, means to align oneself with the natural order of life and oppose mass industrialization, oppression, and states of aggressive warfare, Dar al-Harb. McCarron also acknowledges the presence of progressive Muslim thought which may not be explicitly anarchist but supports common struggles such as feminism, queer rights, and deep ecology. He then links to, amongst others, the website for progressive Muslims and an article on Ezzat's Islam Online. Finally, there is the example of Heba Raouf Ezzat. In 2001, she wrote the article Anarchism, a word unjustly maligned in translation for Islam Online, a popular information site about Islam that she co-founded. She has described herself as an Islamist woman social democrat with anarchist passion, and in a book produced by the British Council she, together with Ahmed Muhammad Abdallah, lays out her vision of an Islamic secularism. Though she is herself a Sunni Islamist, she is critical of the way that some Islamists and other Muslims have adopted authoritarian positions. In an interview with Rosemary Beckler, she states, "Many intellectuals tried to Islamicize the model of the nation-state. From my point of view, this is in fact an anti-Islamic direction to take. It is a model which disempowers the people, which tries to monopolize the public domain and which always reduces civil society to dependence on the state in one way or another. What we mean by Islamic secularism is not that Islam is subject to secular restructuring, but that through Islam, we can arrive at a form of secularism which suits us. We can decide where the power of the state should be minimal, where the power of the people should be maximized, where law enters, and where morality rather than law decides." Her point is that the rise of global civil society enables us to think in new ways about how we conceive the nation-state, how we structure society, and what role religion ought to play in that process. As it contends that religious community acts as an empowering buffer zone between the state and individuals. Ultimately, it is the Ummah, the community of the faithful, not the state, that is for her the central political term within Islam. It is in that context that she envisions an interactive fatwa, grassroots civil ijtihad, and civil jihad. Thus, structures of local governance are interwoven with ritual practices that promote justice and equality. Salvation is not merely an individual endeavor, according to Ezzat, but is explicitly collective as well. Overall, Ezzat's thinking is an independent development that makes no reference to the work or thought of any of the other writers discussed here. Comparative analysis. The most thorough and scholastic works completed in the study of anarchism in Islam so far are that of Ahmet Karamustafa and Patricia Crone. Karamustafa portrays an Islamic anarchism which bases itself on a profound rejection of society as a whole and is characterized by an individualist emphasis on personal transformation. Writing as a scholar and a Muslim, his concern is primarily about how these groups are seen in a Muslim and a scholarly context and not how they are viewed by anarchists. Crone, on the other hand, concerns herself exclusively with two otherwise quite orthodox Muslim groups. As she notes, the Najdiyya and anarchist Mu tazilites were not interested in communism, revolution, or social reform but only sought to resolve the dilemma of political and religious leadership of the Muslim community. We can also see how the Muslim concept of ijma, consensus, helped incite the Najdiyya's call for anarchism. Writing as a scholar and from a secular European perspective, she seems primarily concerned with how these groups are seen by academia and does not seem to be writing for either a primarily Muslim or anarchist audience. All of these groups, from the heretical dervishes to the puritanical Najdiyya, fall into Gemie's quest for alternative conceptions of anarchism. While the differences between them abound, the most notable commonality between them is that as far as their anarchistic elements go, they are fairly unidimensional and undeveloped. Whether it be the Calendars rejecting society as a whole or the Tazilites rejecting the imamate specifically, there is hardly any degree of anarchistic theory beyond those areas. There is no clear articulated expression as to how an anarchist society ought to be organized, attained or maintained, nor is there a developed concept of anti-statism. Instead, the more developed side of these groups' thought and lifestyle remains on the side of Islam, whether heretical or orthodox. Another more minor commonality that these groups shared was their temporality. While strains of their thought and practice have resurfaced throughout the centuries, the original groups faded away with no continual legacy or tradition to carry on their anarchistic creeds. When it comes to Wilson, we are treated to not one but several versions of Islamic anarchism, including some of which he himself is a part of. Though he presents a number of alternative visions, he notably rejects the version offered by Crone. Whereas both the Wilson and Dervish variants of Islamic anarchism involved a large degree of antinomianism, including some degree of pederasty or pedophilia, Wilson's version exceeds that of the Dervishes by liberating the individual from any communal regulation or external authority whatsoever. Writing as an heretical non-practicing Muslim, independent researcher, and popular anarchist ideologue, he is primarily concerned with inspiring a largely anarchist readership. Hence, the reliability of Wilson's research may have suffered in his quest for poetic facts. Barclay, in his summary of the study of Islam and anarchism, aligns himself with Crone's position and also raises the idea that Muslim societies based on tribal structures and segmentary lineage may well be regarded as anarchic. Writing as a scholar and anarchist for an anarchist audience, his primary goal is to argue that there may indeed be signs of anarchism within Islamic history and society. Wilson's writings, such as his complex and colorful depiction of the assassins, generally fall into the category of Gemie's quest for alternative conceptions of anarchism and potentially the category of anarchist practice as well. Barclay's contribution, on the other hand, is the first to fill the criteria for an anthropological anarchism according to Gemie's model. Then there are the more explicit advocacy-oriented contributions. Knight's vision is one of multiple heresies and quasi-orthodoxies living under the same roof and together manifesting in Islam, where individualists are bound together in a radically intentional pluralism. Writing primarily as a seeker for whoever will read it, Muslims and subcultural punks in particular, his book had the unintended consequence of manifesting that which he was writing about. Like the dervishes, Knight's emphasis is on Islam and the individual's contact with God. Earthly authority is in general disregarded as opposed to conceptually dismantled. Carney's assertion is more explicitly anarchist in its claim that state power is incongruent with an Islamic quest for a just society. Directing himself primarily to academics and Muslims, Carney makes a case for reconceptualizing the way we approach political Islam. For him, the relationship to God is personal and therefore liberty must be collective. While his stance may have been shared by fellow Shiites, he does not give any indication of being associated with a larger Islamic anarchist community. McCarron, on the other hand, presents a green anti-consumerist vision of Islamic anarchism rooted in grassroots activism and utilizes key Islamic concepts such as shura, salam, and, like Carney, the specifically Shiite concept of the hidden imam in order to produce an innovative synthesis which includes the religious as well as the political. Although he is writing as an individual Muslim and anarchist, his political thought is collectivist and directed toward an activist audience. While McCarron's text innovatively bridges, or synthesizes, Islamic and Western green socialist anarchist concepts, Knight and Carney employ their inherently Western minds to the development of libertarian tendencies already inherent within Islam. Though their strategies are quite similar, their results are less so. Knight's vision takes him down a path that is rooted in antinomian mysticism and heresy, in line with Karamustafa's dervishes and Wilson, while Carney's theological and philosophical discourse is built in a steady scholastic manner more akin to Crone and focuses more on the state, liberty, and structural power in the history of Islamic thought. Since neither Knight, Carney nor McCarron come from the Third World, Gemie's model would seem ill-suited to categorizing their views. Ezzat, however, seems to at least partially fulfill Gemie's quest for a Third World anarchism in her articulation of how an ideal Islamistic society would manifest. While not explicitly anarchist herself, her vision uniquely blends inspiration from European anarchists with a social democratic interpretation of Islamist concepts in an era of global civil society. Unlike the heretical and individualist-oriented anarchism of Wilson and Karamustafa's dervishes, she advocates a distinctly Umm-oriented version of Sunni Islamic social democracy with anarchistic elements. She is writing as an academic and Muslim activist for a Muslim and predominantly non-anarchist European and Middle Eastern audience. A tentative new model for the study of Islamic anarchism. Now, in light of the above material, we can return to what this might tell us about the model provided by Sharif Gemie. Its most useful distinction seems to be that of drawing a line between anthropological anarchisms and alternative conceptions of anarchism. Here, however, it would seem that Barclay provides a helpful tip in his own distinction between anarchism and anarchy. Hence, Gemie's model could be revised to speak of anthropological anarchies as opposed to anarchisms. Gemie's model also helps distinguish between Islamic anarchism and those whom he refers to as imitations of Euro-American anarchism, that is, secular anarchist groups in the Muslim world who base themselves on classical European anarchist arguments and worldviews. Beyond that, Gemie's model can tell us little about Islamic anarchism as such, nor was it his intent to do so. The category of alternative conceptions is so broad so as to be nearly all-inclusive in this area, and the category of anarchist practice is only of limited relevance here and all too hingent on how that term is defined. Even the act of defining it may lean closer to anarchist polemics than anarchist studies. Finally, there are cases that arise in which Gemie's model becomes impotent when the anarchisms that are articulated can hardly be termed third world. Alternative models are required. It is not possible right now to do justice to the richness and complexity of the material, but a crude tool might be crafted in order to at least begin digging. In the tentative model that follows, I suggest distinguishing between three different vantage points: studies of anarchist theory, wherein Islamic anarchism appears in contrast to any other religious anarchism such as Taoist or Christian anarchism; studies in the anarchic traits of tribal Muslim societies, corresponding to Gemie's anthropological anarchism and Barclay's conception of tribal anarchy; and finally, studies of the anarchical structure of Islam, not covered here but discussed elsewhere in the work of Mandeville, Volpe, Turner and others. Within each category further distinctions can be made based on qualitative developments. A general charting of them might appear like this: Type 1. Studies of Islamic anarchist theory. Organic Islamic anarchism, including the work of Crone and Karamustafa. Postmodern Islamic anarchism, including Wilson, Knight, McCarron, etc. Type 2. Studies in the anarchic traits of tribal Muslim societies. Pre-modern Muslim anarchy, Barclay's Berbers and Bedouins. Postmodern Muslim anarchy, not yet manifest or studied. Type 3. Studies of the anarchical structure of Islam. Anarchical Islam, Caliphate period. Hyper-anarchical Islam, post-Caliphate period. Regarding Type 1, organic is meant to refer to any religious anarchism that arises independent of influence from classical anarchist theory, and this would include all religious anarchism that preceded the 18th century, whether European or otherwise. Postmodern is meant to refer to that point, historically and culturally, at which the two worlds meet and are capable of producing a synthesis. Either of these subtypes could potentially draw further distinctions between, for example, esoteric and literalist or individualist and communist variations of Islamic anarchism. What all of these variants share in common is that Islam as a conceptual framework is the base from which an anarchist theory is developed. While Carney is correct in observing that both Muslim and Christian anarchists refer to God as the sole authority, there are differences as well. Firstly, as Crone points out, the two traditions base themselves on different utopian premises. Secondly, it is not uncommon for Christian anarchists to situate themselves within a larger tradition of Christian nonviolence. While Christian anarchists, such as Leo Tolstoy or Jacques Ellul, may develop a critique of the state as violent, Islamic anarchists rarely, if ever, apply a theory of nonviolence as an argument against the state. Nonviolent activism does appear within Islam, but either the nonviolent activists are not anarchist or researchers in Islamic anarchism simply do not regard them as such. In regard to studies in the anarchic traits of tribal Muslim societies, Type 2, there is already a question of synthesis inherent in the material, that of the potential synthesis between tribal culture and Islamic religion. Therefore, the term organic, in this case, might be replaced by pre-modern to better characterize the point of distinction. A postmodern tribal anarchy in Islam, wherein anarchist theory in Muslim faith meets tribal culture, may not even yet exist, but it has the potential to do so. As for the final category, Type 3, the study of Islam as anarchical has not been covered here, but it appears nonetheless to be a related area of study that is clearly distinct from the other two types. This tentative model is far from developed and, even so, is only a starting point from which one might begin to examine the junctures between Islam and anarchism. In any case, what all these expressions do reveal is that there exists a set of concepts which within the structural and conceptual framework of Islam can lend themselves to anarchistic interpretations. A basic theme is that of devoting allegiance to none other than God, Karamustafa's dervishes, Latif, and Carney. We have also seen the following ideas espoused: shura, the idea that leadership has to consult with the community about decision-making; jihad as a call for social justice; the concept of ummah as a form of civil society; ijma, which refers to the need for consensus in the community; and finally the idea of ijtihad, which enables all traditional concepts to be reinterpreted in a modern light. These ideas demonstrate that concepts do exist within the heart of Islam that can lend themselves to anarchistic interpretations, and have done so. We can also see how research on Islamic anarchism can generally be divided into several camps depending on how anarchism and Islam are defined. The researchers and the goals in their writing are as diverse as the results of their studies. We have seen individualist anarchist heretical Muslims as well as strictly anti-statist Orthodox Muslims and even socialist anarchist manifestos within the Muslim fold. None of these can tell us what Islamic anarchism is, but all of them tell us how an Islamic anarchism might be imagined, even if the imagining borders on the realm of wishful thinking and fantasy. We have seen in the case of night how even a fantasy can manifest in reality. Yet the study of an Islamic anarchism is not merely about imagining potential options for how things could be, it is also about engendering a genuine historical understanding of human relations and social organization as close to the facts as we can come. When Wilson describes the assassin community in relation to syndicalism, individualist anarchism, and Bakunanism, one can only wonder the degree to which he is reflecting his own personal inclinations. Furthermore, one could also ask how applicable the Western conception of individualist versus collectivist anarchism is in an Islamic context. Are we really understanding what Ezzat means by ummah, or do we take a mental shortcut and nearly translate it to mean community or civil society? As Carney suggests, our taxonomy of Islamic politics in general is in need of revising. Even the terms anarchism and anarchy in and of themselves may unduly taint our abilities to conceive the political and social realities and conceptual frameworks of cultures far apart from our own, such as the Berbers, the Qalandars, or the Najdiyya. Imagining history can easily be overrun by conscious or unconscious projections rather than an open and uninhibited sense of discovery. How does terminology, the cultural location of the terminology, as well as the researcher, and the potential emotional charge that is often tied to such terminology affect the researcher's ability to grasp that which has taken place in distantly foreign times and situations? Might the very term anarchism obfuscate rather than clarify our understanding of groups or individuals who have not historically self-identified as anarchist or even been exposed to it as we tend to conceive it? Might Western political concepts in general hinder us from grasping even modern innovative proposals such as Ezzat's conception of an Islamic secularism and a monarchicama? Is anarchism even a useful term, or would researchers be better served by using more precise terms? For example, one might refer to the dispersal of authority, polycentric, or the pluralization of authority, the latter having been applied by Mandeville, the minimalization of authority, minarchy, the preferred term by the anarcho-capitalists at Minaret of Freedom, the expansion of individual freedom, libertarian as applied by Carney, opposition to all forms of tyranny, anti-authoritarian, one of the terms used by McCarron, or opposition to the state as such, anti-statist. What language and concepts are ultimately going to draw the boundaries for our scholastic imagination, and which ones will maximally expand our potential? Will our definitions be very restrictive or highly inclusive? As long as there is a broad plurality in the definitions of anarchism and Islam, then it could be maintained that research on Islam and anarchism ought to embrace that plurality. The alternative could derail into internal disputes within Islamologist and/or anarchist scholarship about the real meaning of those words. It may be that, to paraphrase and modify Crone's axiom, if precise definitions keep leading to unconstructive scholarly conflict, the best solution may be to not create them. More general working definitions seem better suited to sorting out the array of material in this new field. Precise definitions can follow in the wake of advanced study but need not lead to a partisan quest for the true meaning of any given term. Rather, the challenges that the material provides can be used to question the limits of our cultural references and inevitably limited sense of imagination. This chapter has reviewed the main threads of the brief history of English-based research on anarchism within Islam and attempted to apply Sharif Gemie's model for categorizing various types of third world anarchisms. From the more academic-oriented work of Patricia Crone, Ahmet Karamustafa, and Harold Barclay to the more activist and advocacy-oriented work of Peter Lamborn Wilson, Michael Muhammad Knight, Abd al-Hakeem Carney, Michael Salim McCarron, and Heba Raouf Ezzat, a great diversity was seen which ranged from extreme anarcho-individualism and contemporary heresy to religiously conservative and reluctant anarchists of the 9th century. Gemie's model for approaching Third World anarchism, together with insights garnered from Barclay, helped lead to the tentative proposal of a new model. It was concluded that sufficient material exists to fruitfully investigate the degree and manner in which anarchist, anti-authoritarian, or libertarian elements manifest within the Islamic community. Ultimately, the attempt to imagine an Islamic anarchism has unfurled a host of questions with implications that stretch far beyond the boundaries of the subject at hand. At the very least, we may want to question the authority of our own conclusions even before they have been drawn. At the most, the next step in research can provide us with new questions to grapple with and hopefully somewhat sturdier ground to stand on in order to face them.